Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another live Google Hangout here at NAACP Digital, right here online. We're broadcasting live on YouTube, and you're also watching us on some awesome online real estate at the NAACP, as well as our partners at the Steve Fund. This is our first conversation in the series in partnership with the Steve Fund, preparing our national AXO competitors for the National AXO competition coming up this summer, July 14th through the 17th in Cincinnati, Ohio. The Steve Fund has partnered with AXO to assist all of our competitors with measuring success in AXO, school, and life. And today we have some awesome people that are going to join us in this conversation. Listen, if you have not registered for the National AXO competition, make sure you register for the National AXO competition. Visit www.naacpconvention.org. That's www.naacpconvention.org for further details for housing as well as for registration. We look forward to receiving all of you in Cincinnati. Joining us, as you heard me mention, the Steve Fund is Sarah Bennett from the Steve Fund, who we are partnering with for the National AXO competition. Sarah, good evening. How are you?
I'm good. Good evening. How are you all? Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today.
Absolutely. We're glad that you are here. Sarah, I keep saying the Steve Fund, the Steve Fund, the Steve Fund. You know it way better than I do. However, I'm becoming familiar and am familiar with the Steve Fund right now. Tell us what exactly the Steve Fund is and what you all do. And sorry about that awesome work that you all do there.
Absolutely, yep. So the Steve Fund is the nation's only nonprofit organization focused on promoting the mental health and emotional well-being of young students of color. We work with students, practitioners, clinicians, researchers, universities, colleges, and groups serving diverse populations. So we aim to stimulate dialogue and to promote effective programs and strategies that build understanding and assistance regarding the mental health and emotional well-being of the nation's students of color as they enter, matriculate in, and transition from higher education. And so one of the services that we provide is through the crisis text line by using text messaging as a means to improve the critically needed access for young students of color to crisis counseling. So you can actually text Steve, S-T-E-V-E, to 741-741. If you ever find yourself in a stressful moment where you need additional support, again, you can text Steve to 741-741 and you will be immediately connected to a trained crisis counselor over a crisis text line. And finally, I'm very excited to introduce the launch of our Youth Advisory Board. And the Steve Fund's committed to leadership, dialogue, and engagement by young people of color to build better, stronger, and broader approaches across the country for mental and emotional well-being. So you can visit our website, www.stevefund.org, for more information.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Now, you mentioned that text line again was 741-741, and the key word that folks should text is Steve, S-T-E-V-E, correct?
That is correct.
Awesome, awesome. If you're just joining us, this is our conversation with the Steve Fund here at the National AXO office at the NAACP in preparation for our national competition, our 38th national competition for NAACP AXO. What an exciting time it's going to be in Cincinnati. Now, Sarah, the Steve Fund has awesome resources available to young students of color. One you have invited to participate in the conversation today, correct?
That is correct, yep.
Awesome. Tell us about our guest.
So today joining us we have Dr. Michael Gerard Mason from Virginia Commonwealth University. So he joined the staff of the African American Affairs in the spring of 2015. He serves as the Assistant Dean and as the Director of the Luther Porter Jackson Black Cultural Center. He believes that as a people we must be diligent in our struggles to understand and appreciate the meanings of Black, historically and currently, to each of us individually and, to the extent possible, to us all collectively. It is equally important to connect this understanding and appreciation to the ways we prepare our students for leading, learning, and living as young Blacks in our global society. As the director of the Luther Porter Jackson Black Cultural Center, Dr. Mason is responsible for creating opportunities to link Black culture and identity development to the whole Black student experience. And prior to joining the OAAA staff full-time, Dr. Mason held several positions at Virginia Commonwealth University. In 2008, Dr. Mason joined the faculty of the Counselor Education Department in the Curry School of Education as an assistant professor. And in 2010, he transitioned to a clinical position, multicultural specialist, in the Elson Student Health Counseling and Psychological Services Department, where he served as a staff psychotherapist and liaison to African American Affairs.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. And Dr. Mason, welcome to today's conversation. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thank you all for having me.
Totally. We're excited that you are here and excited to hear what you are going to share. Before you share your awesome tips with us, tell us a little bit about what you do. Sarah just gave an excellent bio for you, but tell us a little more about what you do at the university and how you got there.
So I think, so I'll make one comment. I'm actually at the University of Virginia. I love VCU, but it's a little bit different. And I think one of the most important things that I do here at the university is I'm an assistant dean of the Office of African American Affairs. And what that means is I'm challenged with three of my colleagues to take very high-performing young black students and make sure that as they matriculate, they continue to grow in their identity as black young people, and as young black people who can accomplish mighty things. And that's probably the most important role I have here at the university. A second role is that I'm a multicultural specialist at CAPS, Counseling and Psychological Services, and in that role, I'm responsible for making sure that the services that we provide, the psychological services that we provide to the students across the entire university, are culturally relevant and in many ways multiculturally sensitive. And then a final thing that I do here is I'm an assistant professor in the Curry School of Education, and there I teach students how to become better peer supporters to their classmates and to the students broadly in the Charlottesville community.
That's amazing, and I love that you're making the connection from the university level as well throughout the other generations of young people in your local community. As a young person, though, what did you find, or what inspired you to help you get to where you are now? You mentioned some pretty impressive credentials, and you've got some pretty strong responsibilities to the people that you serve. How did you get there?
So every day I wonder that myself. It's quite the mystery how I was able to be so fortunate to have the role that I do. For instance, right now I'm doing this Google Hangout in the Black Cultural Center, Dowson's Road number 3, which is one of the few buildings on these grounds, on all of these acres, that has a direct lineage to slavery. Documented connection to slavery. There were slaves who dwelled in this house. And that's sort of overwhelming, but also very motivating. So in some ways I'm very gifted, not in the sense of my performance, but gifted in the sense of being blessed to be able to have this responsibility. But I do think it started a long time ago, probably when I was around 9 or so. I think I figured out that I was black. And over time I realized that that was actually a beautiful thing. And that in itself started me to begin to read a lot, constantly, voraciously, and also to continue to discover what blackness meant to others, and trying to find the connections between myself and the community, myself and the world. And that's just sort of led me from job to job to job, where now I'm able to help develop that curiosity and to encourage that exploration in others. That's how it happened.
And I imagine that it also probably happened through the outpouring and the belief of someone else in your community, whether it been a community supporter, a church member, or a family member who pushed you along the way, correct?
Absolutely. I was very fortunate, as many of us are. I was able to have the shoulders of the community to carry me both through elementary, middle, and high school, but through college. And even now, I was fortunate. Where's the when was that? In 2012. After a long time of being in school, I was actually invited back to do the Freedom Fund banquet, be the keynote speaker. So that was sort of wonderful to sort of go full circle in my own development.
Totally, totally. So you mentioned Freedom Fund banquet. You said invited back. That means there is some kind of history with the NAACP in your journey. I mean, you can't just say I went back to the Freedom Fund dinner unless you had been there before, right?
Yeah. Yes. So when I was growing up, my name is Michael Mason, but when I was growing up, I had a few of my buddies call me Stokely for Stokely Carmichael.
Ah.
Because at a very early age, I sort of developed a militance about being black. But what was interesting is I didn't really have a community to sort of process what the meaning of some of the things I was reading, what those meanings were, until I discovered the youth chapter of the NAACP back home in Jackson Parish in Louisiana. And I spent quite a bit of time growing as a leader, ultimately becoming the president of that chapter, ultimately going on to start a chapter at my undergraduate at New Orleans, Dillard University. But I spent a lot of time, in some ways, cutting my teeth on what it meant to be a social justice advocate, what it meant to be courageous in the face of adversity. So the NAACP and all of those people who mentored me was pretty important. So to be back giving that very important keynote address in front of all of these elders who had sort of helped me develop myself, that was pretty amazing, actually.
So I take it that, and like so many other young people that have come through the NAACP, you utilize these skills that you used then as a young leader, now as an adult leader. Talk a bit about those skills that you developed throughout your leadership within the NAACP. A little bit about myself. I am an AXO alum, like many of our students will become as they matriculate through the AXO program when they graduate from high school. Talk about those skills that you learn and leadership opportunities that they provided by the NAACP.
So I think some of the skills that I learned primarily fit, I guess, into the domain of justice, which I think those transcend most issues. Those are universal sort of ideas, the idea of leadership. And it's the willingness to organize groups in the pursuit of fairness, equity, justice, civic liberties. Organizing groups in that pursuit is one of the most important things that I've done. And I remember being, as early as maybe 10 or 11, leading a protest in Lake Providence, Louisiana, as I was trying to get rights to go to a hospital instead of having to drive 50 miles away. Those are things that I learned very early in my life. This idea of fairness and not letting my emotions, my affect sort of cloud my decisions or even make me biased in one way or the other. Really being diligent about accumulating enough information to make good decisions, I think. So that's one, fairness. And the other is teamwork, which is really a commitment to carrying people with you. Not necessarily doing leadership just because it benefits me, but being a leader because it benefits a community. And those are things that I sort of carry with me, even in my work and with my colleagues, with the students I'm working with, or with faculty and staff here. This idea about justice and being all-inclusive justice.
You mentioned justice, and you mentioned also building community. One of the things that AXO seeks to do is to build community, not just within the adults, the community that supports AXO, but really through the young people that are matriculating through this program. We've got students that are scholars and scholars in the creative arts, scholars in humanities, in business, and STEM. We have students that are scholars in 32 areas of study in AXO. So there's opportunity there for them to build community. How can those skills that you learned on the justice, the social advocacy side of things, be translated into skills that our students on the AXO side of things? How can they use that to build community?
I think, so I was just doing a workshop today with about 43 of the students who have elected positions as students of governance here at the university. And they asked that very question: how can they begin to build a community among students who had no knowledge of each other prior to being elected? And to me, I think the core issue is accepting that it is possible that by sacrificing one's own goals, achievements, at the in pursuit of helping somebody else, you actually might grow stronger. I think that's a big thing. So by being able to help others, being willing to help others, being committed to help others, even as you grow, I think you actually become closer to the people who are surrounding you. And that's particularly important in competition. I think because what is more likely to happen is because people are so invested in winning, they find themselves disconnected from other people. So work diligently to connect versus to compete.
That's important, especially leading up to our national competition. So many students are intensive trainings and studies right now, aiming to go for the gold in Cincinnati when they arrive for competition day. But you said they should aim to connect versus aiming to compete. How do things like that translate for student action? You say aim to compete, aim to connect and not compete. Well, they want to win the scholarship. They want to win the gold medal, the silver, the bronze medal. So how do you break that down for one of our students?
That it may seem harder than it actually, I'll say it so easily, but I recognize it is hard because there's so much invested in it. But I think one of the things I've come to appreciate here at the university is, here at UVA, most of the students who we recruit and who accept admissions here are probably going to be coming here from the top 5% of the class. Most of them have done extremely well academically. But the reality of the situation is, regardless of how good the pool is, regardless of how good the competition is, there is always going to be about 65% of us who are average. That's true no matter what. And I think what I've tried to do is to figure out motivation for competing. So what is it that drives people? What is it that makes people passionate about music, business, learning, English? What is it that makes people who they are? Because those things will be true regardless of whether they win or lose. And if you are connecting to individuals on the things that make them who they are, then it's more likely to be sustained regardless of outcomes. And I think that's one of the things that I try to push even here as we encourage students to work as hard as they can, but try to figure out who are the people around you, not just who are the numbers you need to beat, the performances you need to outdo, but who are the people behind them. And I think in that way you sort of grow stronger as a competitor, actually, because you begin to have an intimate understanding of the people who are performing against you.
Are there other things that you've gathered from your experience as a student leader, as a student advocate, and then into your adulthood that you could take and you could apply to competitions like ACT-SO? Some of our students are involved in many other competitions. Now, a personal shout out to ACT-SO. There's no other competition like ACT-SO, but I would say there are other competitions designed for amazing high school students like our ACT-SO scholars. What are those tools that these students can use to apply to competition as well as the overall experience that they would encounter in situations like this?
I think one thing that is probably a very important tool is to begin to understand the meaning and importance of the word balance. I think that is probably one of the things that would be most instrumental to anybody who's pursuing multiple things at once, particularly students. Because as good as you might be at playing the flute, it does you no good if you're not also attending to your emotional connections to family, if you're not attending to your academic responsibilities in school, if you're not attending to faith and spirituality. Ultimately, the flute will become meaningless. So I think for me, really starting to grapple with what does it mean to hold things in balance. So that's definitely one that I think is important. Another would be growing in their ability to use support. Because I know a lot of students will, because they're so driven, it becomes difficult to have people who understand their drive, or who understand their motivation. So sometimes they disconnect. But in this case, I think it would be very much a wise thing for them to begin to identify who are the supporters behind them. And again, I'm really pushing this idea about what's behind the victory. So find people who are supporting them in their passion for a competition, their motivations for competing, not necessarily for the outcomes of win or lose, but find people who are supporting them and growing in all of the multifaceted ways that they're trying to. And I guess the other would be to not work alone. I mean, the beauty of this thing that the NAACP has created is that it's now created a community of children, a community of students, a community of people who are competing. And I think that is the underlying strength of the competition, is that you all have identified extremely gifted young people. And I think for me, I would really encourage them to try to form long-lasting relationships, even as they discover, whether they become, top 1%, top 2%, top 3%. The truth of the matter is they're probably going to be better performers than most of us. And in some ways, I think that's good enough. Just teaching them that can be good enough, and just dwell in the other that remains.
That's awesome. If you're just joining us, you're watching our conversation here at NAACP ACSO with the Steve Fund featuring Dr. Michael Mason. If you want to join the conversation after this broadcast ends, you're more than welcome to use the hashtag ACSO to share this on Facebook and Twitter or any other social media platform that you're using. Dr. Mason, you mentioned balance, you mentioned support, and you mentioned not going it alone. Let's look at this not going it alone. Sometimes students might feel that they can survive as an island. They might feel that they are the one who thinks like, the only one that thinks like this and does this and acts this way or is created this way. And granted, all of us are uniquely made. However, how would you suggest a student push themselves to step off of the island and engage with other young people when they might be a little timid in that realm?
Mm-hmm. I sometimes appeal to the competitor in the young people that I'm working with. For me, I think there's a simple logic. We're only as strong as all of us. We're only as wise as all of us. We're only as gifted as all of us. And what that means to me is it is in my advantage. It's to my advantage to take advantage of what is around me. So if you're on this island, and there are two people, and you have a coconut, you have no idea how to open the coconut, and the other person on the island knows how to open the coconut, you'll probably starve to death if you just have to discover how to open it on your own. It's actually more efficient to use the support of the other person. This is true in more complex sort of situations, and I would encourage people to do that, even if it's piano. There are going to be people who are technically stronger in some things, weaker in others. And I think it benefits both to sort of pursue what are the strengths of each of you and sort of grow in that way. So I think it's just in some very simple ways, simple logic, it's just better and it's more efficient, because the sooner you resolve a problem, the more you can practice. So the whole point of this is to get to a place where you can begin to master knowledge versus discover it. And I think sometimes when you're just out there as a lone wolf, you spend a whole lot of time discovering rather than mastering.
I like it. Now, we've discussed not going it alone. You did a deep dive conversation about support. Let's talk about balance. Many students, and not just ACSO students, but many students that might watch this online afterwards, are involved in so many activities outside of ACSO, outside of sports, outside of church organizations that they're involved in. How do students manage balance, especially from a high school standpoint? You've got students preparing for final exams at this time. Some students who, when they're in 12th grade, of course, they're preparing to take on their next steps. How do they manage balance and then still try to find time to invest in their talents? Heavy question, right?
That is the $1 million question. I wish I had an answer. Otherwise, I would probably be independently wealthy by now. But I think the idea is to try to be as clear as you can, as honest as you can be with yourself about what are the things that matter. because I think that is sort of how we decide where we're going to spend most of our time. And the reality of it is, and I'll use an example here at the University of Virginia. There are some students who do extremely well. We call them intermediate honor winners, award winners. And these are students who have maintained top 20% placement academically at the university through first and second year. And the one thing that seems to be true about all of these students is they spend an inordinate a lot of time, roughly about 35 hours a week, which is almost a full-time job, just reading about what they're learning, thinking about what they're learning, in addition to going to class, in addition to doing homework, and in addition to preparing for exams. It's really this idea of spending time in what matters. And I think that's one of the things that we'll have to discover when we're starting to think about balance. So you have a finite amount of time. It's not like you can create new time just because you have something else that's interesting. So one of the things that I would encourage people to do is just make a list. What are the activities that matter? And then what are the outcomes that will come from those things that matter? So let's, for instance, say, what happens if I win ACSO? What comes out of that? If the answer is I get a certificate, that's fine. And then you look at item number 2, which could be academic work at school. If you get, in this last term, straight A's, you get a full scholarship to college. All right. So now you have to start weighing in the balance. So which ones are going to be more important? And then you can begin to make some informed decisions about where you spend your time. I imagine that being an ACSO competitor is probably a little more incentivized than a certificate. But the idea is you have to figure out which is going to have the biggest bang for the amount of time you have to put in. And sometimes I think students spend a lot of time investing in things that don't have really big outputs. And I think that's just one of the ways that I would recommend people think about it.
But figuring out those things in their life that have the biggest outcome or output for them, is it okay for them to test the waters? So you're looking at a potential 8th grader who is going to participate in ACSO next year. I mean, they've got 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th grade to figure it out. Tell us about the safety in taking chances.
So, depending on where people are developmentally, I think it might be a little different for somebody who's 18 going to college versus somebody who's 12 to 14, sort of middle schoolish age, thinking about high school. Depending on where we're talking about, especially starting around 8th grade, at that point, I think we're really trying to figure out who a person is. So at that point, I think the biggest outcome is not necessarily monetary. It's not necessarily scholarship or these sorts of things. I think it's actually figuring out what are the things that give you the best feeling about yourself. So in the 8th grade, that could actually be playing Call of Duty. And I'm fine with that. If that's where you're investing your time and that's where you get the biggest bang from a self-esteem perspective, from a social connected perspective, that's fine. Because the stakes at that point are not as high as they might be as a senior in college. So at that point, I would definitely be investing in sort of finding out what are the things that can be done so that you feel the most confident about taking risks in moments that actually matter a little more. So I think that's what I would say to that response. Really just, as you grow, do things that make you feel really good and that help you connect both to your inner self, and to family, and to whatever is bigger than us. And I think that's the key.
That's amazing, and I love that you encourage the younger student to if a video game gives you the satisfaction and inspires you to want to create and do something else, then stick to that, but also let that evolve to become a greater output for your life. Correct?
Yep.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I love that. I love that. Now, we've got different groups of people that work to support our AXO students. We have a group that we call the AXO chairs. Those are the local leaders that volunteer throughout 150 NAACP branches to lead our students throughout the school year above and beyond what the students do in their school. And then there's the families that sign them up for AXO, or the family, someone in their family unit. It might not be a biological relative, but it might be someone that see something special inside of our students. How can these groups of people, specifically the families, we'll talk about the chairs next, but let's talk about the families. How can families be a part of this process and finding balance and helping the students not go it alone, and supporting them throughout this process, especially leading up to July? And talk about the family, from the mom, the dad, the grandparent, the big sister, the big brother, even the little sisters and the little brothers.
That's a whole lot.
It's the family, right?
I think I had to write down all the people you're calling out there. You know, one of the things that I think has been really, really good for me to watch, in my own family unit, my daughter played the piano for a very, very, very long time, probably from age 3 to about 14. So that's almost 12 years she played the piano, and she was really good and still is. So one of the things that we would negotiate with her, because I wanted her to have as much time as she felt like she needed to practice and to do recitals. So we would have to do some trade-offs. So I might do the dishes more often if that meant that you could play the piano, but you have to figure out some other way to be contributor to the house. And I think that's one of the things that I encourage families here throughout the city, is to just find meaningful ways that each person in the family can contribute. At the same time, how then can the family support each individual unit to sort of grow into themselves, into their passions? And I think that's the first thing. The other is, I think the mom and dad, the grandma, the grandpa, because they have a position of experience, wisdom, I think they might be able to set healthy parameters around anything we're passionate about. So back to Call of Duty. Everything is great in moderation. So if the student is choosing to express themselves and grow in self-confidence by playing 20 hours of Call of Duty a day, that's probably not very helpful. So in those moments, I think it's up to the parents to try to just set healthy limits, help students learn how to do things in moderation, which goes back to balance. Because I think at that point, especially as you're describing, 6th grade to 8th grade, 9th even to 11th grade, even 12th, actually even the 22-year-olds I'm working with have very significant impulse control. And I think that's where families can be most helpful, just sort of helping people become very mature in how they promote themselves, very mature in how they pursue their passions, and how they connect other people to their passions. So for me, I think that's one. And I guess the other is, I would encourage family members to learn as much as they can about what it is that their child is interested in. I remember when my daughter was starting, we were trying to decide on the instrument. And she started with violin, and I've never been musically inclined, but I took up the violin with her. So I had a violin and I was practicing, and I got really good at it. And then when she decided, I think I want to try the piano, and she did that, and I took music piano lessons for maybe 3-4 years with her, and we did recitals together. And I think the key to this is to just try to find ways that you might be able to insert yourself into what the child's passion is. Because ultimately, I think that's where they really get inside of them that you're interested, that you're invested in them, versus just sort of motivated by victory. It's really sort of having some, I guess as people say, having some skin in the game by really committing to helping somebody grow. I think that's the best part of it, for family especially.
And then with the we've got the family, and then there's the group of volunteer leaders that work on AXO committees throughout the country, shepherded by the AXO chairs. How can the AXO chairs and the AXO co-chairs and the committee members be supportive and working somewhat as a familial unit for the young people and really working in tandem while undergirding that which the family is doing? And then if the family isn't doing it, how can those people be supportive as well?
You know, I love the way you describe the local leaders as also as a family unit. I think because they have the same responsibility that I was just describing with some of the caregivers in the family unit. But one thing that I think is probably most important for all of the local leaders, regional, national leaders, is to always be mindful of sibling relationships. And this is why I think this analogy is beautiful, because all of these young people in AXO are like siblings to one another. And what we have to do is just be mindful that even as we encourage them to sort of grow and get better and better, even in competition, it's our responsibility, it's the local leaders' responsibility is to hold together the bond between them so that becomes what we're describing as this family unit. I think that's how it works. So be very ever present, in your thinking that, there's somebody, 3 blocks away who's also really good at this, or there's somebody in another state who's amazing at this. And I think for me, I think that might be the biggest thing you can give, in addition to the things that are, you're sort of doing as a function of being a local leader in the AXO competition. But I think really encouraging people to make connections to the people they're competing with, as in that sort of care imbued sibling sort of relationship where you're just constantly being aware of the experience of the other people.
Great, great. So the local chairs also have another responsibility, and that's really acting as parent while they're going to be on the ground for those students whose parents aren't able to attend, and for the national competition in Cincinnati. What do you say to them to help them or encourage them stand in that gap for the student who is dealing with a stressful situation as it relates to preparing to compete, and then the aftermath that happens after the competition, after the student gives them the feedback of what happened inside of the room?
That's probably the biggest question. There's nothing like, people always, I think I grew up and I heard people say, nobody will love you like your mother, and nobody will love your child like you love them. And I think that's the sort of wisdom that I would give to the local leaders who are there in, standing in the gap for the children and their families, is to just embrace the fact that it may be true that nobody can be as present as their own mother or their own father, but you can be good enough. And I think that's what I would sort of encourage them to be thinking about at all times. As the student is going through the competition, just know that being there for them is extremely valuable in itself. And to not worry about so much having the best consoling words, when things don't necessarily go the way that they would like, or not having the best words to describe the celebration of it all, but just to know that by committing to be there, and I think that's the key, that by committing, there is this expectation from the students, the children, that the leaders are absolutely available. And I think that's the one thing I would encourage them, that if you have committed to stand in the gap, be there. And that will be extremely meaningful to the students you're working with.
I love that. I love that because it really echoes some of the tips that I try to give from in my role to the local leaders, is to be available, be there. So I love you. I love that. I love that it just was birthed organically in this conversation here as well. We're about to wrap soon. So is there anything else that you want to share with our students that are preparing to go to Cincinnati in July and compete for the national title of National AXO medalists and the scholarships and prizes that go along with that?
Yes. The one thing that I would say, it may be 10 years from now before you make sense of it, but it's this one idea that regardless of the outcome of what happens at the national competition, you are amazing. And believe that. No matter what happens, no matter whether you win or lose, that has no bearing on who you are as a person. And just continue to be the beautiful person you are, and that will pay off 10, 15, 20 years from now.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Michael Mason. I appreciate you for joining us today. I'm so appreciative of your time. And I want to remind all of you, don't forget what our friend Sarah said at the beginning of the conversation. You can always look up information regarding the Steve Fund at stevefund.org, STEVEFUND.org. You can also text the word Steve, STEVE, to 741-741 should you find yourself in a crisis. That's Steve. Text the word Steve to 741-741. I'm so grateful for all of you that joined us live here today. Thank you to all of the AXO chairs that went above and beyond and submitted questions for today's conversation. And if you're watching after our live broadcast and want to reach out to us, you can always reach the National AXO office for the NAACP by dialing 410-580-5650. That's 410-580-5650. Remember, the national competition for the NAACP AXO is this summer, July 14th through 17th in Cincinnati, Ohio. We look forward to seeing you there. For further information, you can visit www.naacpconvention.org. For everyone here at the NAACP, I'm Larry Brown Jr., and we will see you in Cincinnati. Bye-bye.